Hello, and welcome everyone to this evening's lecture. I'm so pleased to welcome you to this presentation on returning home, dam repatriations over a half century. My name is Lori Illiff, and I am head of the Provenance Research Department, which was inaugurated in 2022, and it has grown to include two colleagues, Renee Stokesbury, Associate Provenance Researcher, and Matt Coyle, who's our Provenance Research Fellow. Provenance is information about an object's history of ownership from its creation to the current day. Provenance research is an essential part of ethical collecting practices, and it's an important aspect of curatorial work. Researching provenance helps us verify an artist, prove legal ownership, help determine an object's authenticity, and it's also an important part of storytelling that provides us with historical narratives about the artist or object itself, the place where it comes from, and the collectors and collecting tastes of the time. A gap in a work's ownership history is common, especially for works that date back centuries. Gaps in provenance can be attributed to information lost to time, lack of record keeping, natural disasters or war, or even suggest troubling or illegal aspects of an object's journey, and it may be a cause for further research. Now, we have a growing availability of information from digitized records, online databases, and other resources that are continually providing new avenues of information that shed light on our artwork's ownership histories. Now, I took on this role from a background and graduate degrees in art history and archaeology, with positions in 4 other museums, including as a collection manager, registrar, and curator, that predates my 25 years of experience here at the Denver Art Museum. My roles at the museum have ranged from being chief registrar to chief of exhibition and collection services, all of which have helped me be familiar with the museum's collections, donors, and dealers, as well as the museum's history. As head of the department, my colleagues and I work in close partnership with curators and the Provenance Committee on the development of policies, practices, and priorities for provenance research as we continue our commitment to this important work. Tonight, I'm going to focus on stories behind 4 artworks that were repatriated or restituted from the collections of the Denver Art Museum. These 4 important works have powerful stories to tell, and from their origins to landing in the museum's collection and returning home again, their journeys show how collecting practices and legal and ethical standards have evolved over the last half century, and how cultural patrimony concerns continue to be a key focus for provenance researchers, museums, and public interest today. Repatriation or restitution. These 2 works are used often interchangeably, and they mean almost the same thing. When we talk about a repatriation of an object, we're usually referring to return to a national government or a sovereign tribal authority, and a restitution when an object is returned to an individual or a community. Now, these terms have a charged and a more serious meaning than using the words return or transfer, because they embody the idea that an object is going back to a person or a place, a homeland, a community, or a nation where it originated and where it's acknowledged as belonging. You can find stories today about artworks being repatriated or restituted in the news, on websites announced by museums, countries of origin, even by law enforcement agencies. And many of these stories today can be lumped into certain historical or defined categories that have similar circumstances, like when you have restitution of a painting that was looted during the Nazi era during World War II, or repatriation of ancestor remains for cultural items, or ancestor remains or cultural items to affiliated tribal communities. Now, museums with collections that span many cultures and time periods, like the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and even the Denver Art Museum, are often at the center of some of these stories because encyclopedic collections intersect with pretty much all the categories that repatriations fall into. Each repatriation and restitution has its own unique set of circumstances that may involve when and who created the object, why and from where, and how it was removed from its original context, and what its journey was to the museum. They also differ from a unique set of legal and ethical considerations at play at the time that help determine the basis of a decision and to whom the object is returned. The 4 case studies I'm going to share with you tonight give context to the stories of why restitutions and repatriations happen. And these areas are represented by a Zuni war god, which centers on the importance of traditions surrounding indigenous cultural items, a Dutch painting, which exposes the widespread tragedy of Nazi-era looting during World War II, an Indian sculpture that focuses on the issue of theft and looting from the ancient religious sites around the world, and finally, a Benin bronze, a prime example of the historical impact of colonization on cultures and their cultural heritage. Our first case study reveals core issues surrounding repatriations related to American Indian tribes and the importance of indigenous traditional knowledges and practices, and it's also the museum's earliest repatriation. In 1978, the Zuni tribe in New Mexico contacted the museum about a Aheuda, popularly known as a war god that had been acquired as a gift in 1953. Now, the war god was published in various museum handbooks and art books since the 1950s, but after the work was returned, our files were specific, noting that images of it should not be reprinted or released. And so, to give you a sense of the war god from the museum's collection, I show here a 19th century image available online from a 1904 Bulletin of Ethnology taken by John Wesley Powell, the well-known explorer and director of the U.S. Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian and director of the U.S. Geological Survey. The records, and you see here a copy of the Native Arts Department's original catalog card, describes the war god as standing over 20 inches high. He was a stylized, abstract figure like the one you see in Powell's image, and it was made from wood with a face defined with heavy brow and a long nose and a long torso with a tubular segmented element projecting from his midsection. In addition to a tied bundle of prayer sticks that surrounded his base, as well as traces of feathers and other items also tied around the base and neck. The war god was gifted to the museum in 1953 by Clark Field, a successful businessman in Tulsa and an art collector primarily of Native American baskets, as seen here. Now, the original catalog card and a letter from Field records that it was given to him in 1952 by Arthur G. Clark. Clark was a surveyor with the United States Geological Survey who did work in New Mexico and the area around Zuni Pueblo between 1899 and 1901 and 2. It's uncertain how he came across the war god, though it's plausible that it could have been during his surveying. The war god was nearly one of 18,000 objects in the museum's collection one of 18,000 objects in the museum's collection. Now, the museum had an important distinction, different from many other museums with similar collections of the time, because we focused on collecting and developing exhibitions and galleries that promoted work not as ethnographic or anthropological collections, but as art, as you can see here from an exhibition in 1964. Now, when the Zunis approached the museum, they were very sincere, direct, and serious in their discussions with the museum staff, and they explained that the museum was not alone in being asked to return the war god. They made pains to express how central and spiritually important the war gods were, and they conveyed how the war gods, who were twin brothers, possessed vast and destructive powers that served to protect the Zuni tribe and the world. They explained how prayers, blessings, and supplications were needed in times of peace to channel their destructive powers into positive ends, and that the responsibility for those prayers and supplications was vested with the Deer and the Bear clans, whose priests and religious leaders assumed the awesome responsibility after years of rigorous and intensive preparation and training. Every year, the image of each god was created anew and carried to their proper shrine homes, whose locations around Zuni lands were determined since ancient times. And they explained how the war gods were meant to stay at the shrines, even when they were joined by new ones, because they still retained the same powers and were kept together so those powers could be controlled by prayer. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Now, the Zunis and their representatives were very clear that even though only certain clans were authorized to make war gods, they were owned communally by all Zuni tribes and religious leaders. Now, the museum's concern with the request was outlined in a press release. in February of 1979, and this was really unusual because it reflects that the museum was struggling with certain core issues and needing to publicly express concerns. In reviewing the history of how the war god had been acquired, the museum officials at the time felt that it had been acquired in good faith in 1953, that it had a solid history of being exhibited and published over the last 25 years, that it was the museum's mission as an institution to collect, preserve, display, and interpret objects of aesthetic cultural interest, as well as maintain museum collections and trust for the public. That part of that public trust included long-term preservation of collections, and that if returned, the object would be subject to deterioration, which should be contradictory to the museum's basic responsibility to assure preservation. And lastly, that whatever action was taken here would have far-reaching implications for the museum as well as other institutions. Now, in answer to that last concern, museum professional organizations, the American Association of Museums and the American Association of Art Museum Directors, had no guidelines or statements at the time regarding possession of Native American religious objects. Now, as mentioned, the Zuni representatives told museum officials that they were seeking other war gods being held by museums, art dealers, and private collectors, and their commitment to doing this was enshrined in a tribal resolution that had only been signed a year earlier. Also, the American Religious Freedom Act had been newly passed only a year earlier as well, and the purpose of that was to protect and preserve Native American religious cultural rights. But at the time, discussions were happening, no regulations or case law up to that point were in place. Now, at the time the Zunis were negotiating with dam officials, the tribe was also talking with the Smithsonian for war gods in their collection, and also in communication with Sotheby's Park Burnett in New York, which was an auction house that had a Zuni war god for sale, which resulted in Sotheby's withdrawing the work from the sale while negotiations with the consignor and Zuni representatives were taking place. Despite reservations that were expressed in the press release issued only a month earlier, the board approved the return and passed a resolution that was made public in March, which acknowledged their reasoning and stressed certain justifications, including acknowledgement of some of the Zuni tribe's perspectives. That in Zuni religion, the war god was a deity and a living object of worship. That under Zuni law, the war god constituted communal property, which could not be legally sold or given away, and that consideration of the museum's responsibilities included its interest in strengthening its relations with the Zuni people as part of its mission to display and preserve artworks from all cultures with sensitivity and appreciation. The war god was picked up by Zuni representatives in October of 1980, along with two other war gods that were discovered and reviewed with the Zunis during the course of the negotiations. Now, the return of the Zuni war gods was the first repatriation by dam, the first war god repatriated by any museum, and only the second war god after the Sotheby's consignor donated his war god to the Zunis up to that point. But in quick succession, in 1980 and 1981, several other museums in New Mexico and Iowa repatriated their war gods, and others followed. Now, during the decades of the 1980s, other war gods and returns of prominent sacred objects and ancestral remains occurred from institutions, but the momentum was slow, and groups like the National Congress of the American Indian and Native American Rights Fund and other organizations mounted campaigns for the return of sacred works and to claim and rebury ancestral remains and used the law to enforce such returns. So as a result of this groundswell of advocacy and concern, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed 10 years later in 1990. The law required museums receiving federal funds and federal agencies to inventory and repatriate ancestral remains and funerary objects, and also sacred objects and communally owned cultural property under criteria that required consultations to determine cultural affiliation of tribes laying claim, which category under NAGPRA the object belonged, and also clarifying the history around the right of possession. The Denver Art Museum, in response, along with other museums with Native American collections, established internal collection policies that supported the principles outlined in NAGPRA. Now, the example provided by the repatriation of the war gods was important, not just in context to the early time frame, but because war gods were enshrined in the law as a principal example for defining what an object of cultural patrimony was, an object with ongoing historical, traditional, or cultural importance central to a Native American group, and one that could not be alienated, appropriated, or conveyed by any individual. Now, NAGPRA's been in the news, and in January of this year, new guidelines were passed to accelerate the return of ancestor remains and funerary objects. Consultation between museums and federal agencies and Indian tribes had always been part of the NAGPRA process, enshrined in the 1990 version, but a new requirement has also now focused on the role of Indian tribal groups in providing consent before works subject to NAGPRA, including sacred works or works defined as cultural patrimony, should be displayed, accessed, or researched. And this resulted in recent news stories that you may have seen highlighting the removal or covering of some museum displays. Here at DAM, for example, a case of Mississippian and Caddoan works were removed because not all of the 30 tribes claiming descent to these prehistoric cultures had been part of current or past consultations. Today, under guidance of NAGPRA, the museum has repatriated over 30 works to Native tribal groups as well as gifted others outside NAGPRA as engagement with Native communities continues. Now, our next case study and story focuses on a restitution that's related to the legacy of World War II in the context around Nazi-era looting. In March 2000, the museum received an inquiry about a painting in the collection from a firm specializing in estate recovery on behalf of Andrew Rawson. He was a grandson of a Mr. Paul Hartog, who, along with his wife, perished in the Nazi concentration camps. The request suggested that the painting had been sold under duress and requested that the work be restituted to the sole remaining heir of Mr. Hartog, a Marianne Rawson. The painting in question, seen here on the slide, was an oil on canvas called The Letter, believed to be by a follower of the 17th century Dutch painter Gerard ter Borch, who painted in the 17th century and early 18th century. The painting was modest in size and shows a typical Dutch interior domestic scene of everyday life that was a common subject of the upper middle class in Holland. It shows a seated matron with an elaborate taffeta head covering, decorated with lace and seed pearls, dressed in a low bodiced brown silk dress with a pink trim, and she's sitting behind a table covered with a floral decorated rug and is writing a note or letter under the light of a candle held by a gray-coated youth, maybe a page or a messenger, who holds his hat in the other hand. And finishing the scene is a small sleeping dog curled up on the chair to the right, which is totally cute. Now, the painting was purchased by the museum in 1961 from Wildenstein and Company in New York, and this was a prominent dealer in business since the 19th century, specializing in old master works. Wildenstein had acquired the painting in the 1950s, and based on provenance provided at the time of purchase, shown here on the purchase invoice, and subsequent research shows that the work appears in the historical record and in various publications, exhibitions, and auction sales beginning as early as 1872. Wildenstein recorded prior ownership from private collections in England and from other collections in Germany, including Paul Hartog. Now, after the painting was acquired by the museum, it was published in various collection guides starting in 1965, and it hung prominently at various times in the European galleries of the museum until roughly 1978. Axel Heider, who was another grandson of Mr. Hartog and who unfortunately passed away before 2000, became aware of the existence of the painting at the museum when a researcher at the Frick Art Library, who was assisting him seeking his grandfather's collection, found a picture of the letter reproduced in this Denver Art Museum's 1971 collection guide. Now, part of the information surrounding circumstances of the painting's history during the war was sent to the museum in the 2000 request, and it detailed in a copy of a 1985 report that he had filled out and submitted to the International Foundation for Art Research. IFAR was then and still now a very well-regarded nonprofit organization that promotes resources on issues that concentrate on art, provenance research, authenticity, ownership, theft, ethics, and legal matters. Now, information about objects submitted in the reports were at that time printed in IFAR's journal, published about 10 times a year, that contained educational information and a small section highlighting a stolen art alert of new listings. According to information researched and detailed in the report, The painting was one of 31 works that had been part of Paul Hartog's art collection. He was a prominent Jewish dealer who lived in Berlin, and the slide here on the left shows Paul with his daughter Marianne, the surviving heir, and a nanny next to a picture of the Hartog family home in Berlin. A family album of pictures of the house and interior rooms show parts of the collection visible on the walls of the family house. The album was instrumental in helping the family in their quest to try to locate and recover the family collection. And I have to acknowledge the kindness of Andrew Rawson, who has the family album today and was able to share copies of these images. Unfortunately, the painting of the letter is not visible in any of the pictures, but Marianne Rawson, as a little girl, last remembered seeing the painting in 1934, where she recalled it hung in the green salon where my mother played bridge. Now, the circumstances of what happened to Marianne's father and mother, Paul and Gertrude, and you can actually see, you can actually see a picture of Gertrude here on the portrait in the middle, was tragic, and unfortunately all too common for the fate of German Jewish residents. Paul Hartog was unable to support his obligations as owner of his bank due to the forced political and economic pressures that were imposed on Jewish residents, and was forced to sell 16 of his 31 paintings in 1934 and others in another sale in 1938. Now, in November of 1941, a Nazi law was passed that deprived Jews of German citizenship, and unable to leave Germany, the Hartogs made arrangements in July of 1942 to flee to Switzerland, where they had obtained immigration papers. But unfortunately, the driver who offered to take them to Switzerland turned them into the Gestapo, who were already aware of their arrangements and arrested them. They were sent to a Theresienstadt concentration camp, where Paul Hartog died in 1942. Gertrude Hartog died 2 years later after her transfer to Auschwitz. Now, at the start of the war, Marianne was in Britain, where she had been studying, but after returning to England, when she visited her family in Berlin near the start of the war, she was interned as a resident German at Holloway Prison and on the Isle of Wight for 2.5 years. And after she was released, she joined the British Army and accompanied the Allies as an interpreter at the end of the war, where she was able to see that her former home had been destroyed. She lost everything in World War II, including her parents and her family home. According to documentation, but also in the Provenance history, the letter was sold through a Paul Gropp auction in 1934. And you can see a catalog illustration and catalog entry for the letter writer for sale in this slide. Paul Gropp himself was born into a Jewish family, and as a dealer had a well-established international clientele and had permission to continue dealing with auctions until he fled Germany in 1937. Now, his sales in Germany involved the liquidation of many private collections, and he was later put on a red flag list of dealers in a report released after the war by the Art Looting Intelligence Unit, also known by its acronym ALIU, that was part of the U.S. Army. The painting was estimated at the sale at an amount of 10,000 Reichsmark, but was reported as sold for the amount of only 4,000. The remainder of the works in this and the other auction in 1938 were reportedly sold at no more than an average between 10 to 20% of their appraised value. Now, the timing for the request by Andrew Rawson and his representative in 2000 to restitute this painting was fortuitous. It happened concurrently with the confluence of global awareness and a number of initiatives addressing Nazi-era looted art. It's estimated that between 1933 and 1945, over 600,000 artworks and religious objects were seized or sold by the Nazi-era regime through forced sales. And the picture on the left is always so shocking because you can see the soldier just dwarfed by the artworks that have been stored in a church in southern Germany. Am I doing this right? He's so small, I can't even see him. And then by the end of the war, the Allies, and especially the U.S., and the picture on the right shows the monuments men securing stolen art from a castle where they had been stored in Germany in 1945. Now, at the end of the war, the Allies, and especially the U.S., played a significant role in international restitution efforts, and this was done through the work and record-keeping of a unit in the U.S. Army called the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Section Unit, popularly known as the Monuments Men. But despite these efforts, there were still 100,000 of artworks, hundreds of thousands of artworks, with a provenance that could not be fully determined that were returned to governments of post-war Europe or made their way into the rest of the Europe, the United States, as well as artwork that was held by allies, military members that cycled their way through the art market and entered both public and private collections. The first global initiative to focus on Nazi-era looted cultural property since the war didn't occur until 40 years later in December of 1998 in Washington, D.C., and this was 2 years before the dam's restitution request. A conference on Holocaust-era assets was hosted by the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum that was attended by 44 nations and many non-governmental organizations. And at the end of the conference, the participants endorsed 11 non-binding moral principles known as the Washington Conference Principles on Nazi Confiscated Art. These emphasized the importance of how such art should be identified and urged that resources be made available to facilitate their research and make them public. They also encouraged pre-war owners to come forward and make their claims known. And the guidelines recognize that though countries have different legal systems, it encouraged nations to set up fair solutions in resolving ownership issues for pre-World War II owners that had had artwork confiscated unjustly. Now, after the conference, different countries approached restitution issues differently. Countries in Europe like Germany, Austria, Britain, the Netherlands, and France established commissions to adjudicate claims for works in public collections. In the United States, the approach was largely coordinated by museums themselves through their professional organizations, the American Association of Museums and the American Association of Art Museum Directors, which both issued policy statements and guidance in 1998 and 1999, which was followed by the adoption of internal policies by U.S. museums. And the Denver Art Museum's board followed suit with its own collections policy addressing works unlawfully appropriated during the Nazi Holocaust era, and it was announced publicly in the museum's September-October 2000 newsletter that you see here. Now, after the museum received the restitution request in July of 2000, the museum conducted review of the provenance and information provided by the IFAR report. There are many files that I can find that reveal any detailed notes or discussion about the considerations or decision to return the work. It's clear there was never a dispute that the painting had once been part of Paul Hartog's collection or that it had been part of the Gropp sale in 1934. That had always been part of its provenance. But at issue, and pointedly noted in the request to dam, was circumstances of the sale under duress and its resulting sale under market value. In November, the Board of Trustees unanimously approved the accession and return of the work to Mrs. Rawson and issued a press release. The painting was shipped the following February to her son Andrew's residence. And in a newspaper article, Mrs. Rawson was quoted as saying, "I'm happy and I'm sad at the same time. Happy because the painting is coming back and sad because of the memories it constitutes. Now it will hang in my son's living room. He will inherit it after my death. It wouldn't be right to sell it. It's the first work from my family's collection that I've recovered." Now, Mrs. Rawson sadly passed away in 2013, and to this day, the painting still resides with her son, Andrew. According to Andrew, no other paintings from the Hartog collection were ever physically recovered by the family, though in 1964 and later in 1981, the family received a small payment from the German state and a portion of the proceeds from a sale at Christie's. Now, last month actually marked the 25th anniversary of the landmark Washington Principles, and a smaller group of 22 nations led by the State Department signed an agreement to reinforce those guidelines in an effort to bolster restitution efforts. And it's hard to find statistics of how many works have been restituted. There's a lot of variety among countries' historical experiences and legal systems in dealing with claims, but the estimates for how many works are still missing ranges upwards from 60,000 to 100,000. Now, the return in 2001 of the painting The Letter from the Denver Art Museum to the Hartog family was one of the early U.S. museum restitutions of a Nazi-era work without litigation or a settlement, which today still seems to be the exception rather than the rule. To date, there haven't been any other Nazi-era claims from the dam's collections, but we continue to post collections and review provenance histories online for works that may have been in continental Europe during the Nazi era with gaps in their provenance. Now, our next case study and story revolves around circumstances of a theft from an ancient religious site and reveals some of the principal issues that inform our provenance research surrounding ancient art and archaeological collections. In June 2021, the museum received an email from the Consulate General of India in New York about an Indian sculpture in the collection. The sculpture in question is illustrated here and shows a pairing of Shiva in one of his many manifestations, in this case Sadasiva, and his smaller consort Parvati in a divine pairing often referred to as Maheshvara. The sculpture stands over 18 inches high and it's close to 5 inches in depth and portrays a complex scene showing 3 different faces of Shiva with his many arms in hand, with the most discernible ones holding a cup. I can't even see it from here very well, I'm sorry. A trident entwined with a snake, a sword, an arrow being taken from a quiver, a rosary, and on Sadasiva's proper left, you can see a hand carrying a shield, a bow, and one hand near the breast of Parvati. Now, the pair is joined on both sides by images of their son, Ganesha. I think he's in the very corner here. The elephant-headed god and Kumara, god of war, in addition to the guardian deity of Kailash and the kneeling bull Nandi, which is the mount of Shiva. Yeah, I can barely see it from this angle, but at the time of acquisition, it was believed from its style to have originated from northeast India. Consultation with several experts were conducted at the time of the acquisition, and one scholar, Brajendra Nath Sharma from New Delhi, published and illustrated the sculpture the same year it was acquired in a 1976 book called The Iconography of Sadasiva, where he suggested that its style may have been executed in the region of Uttar Pradesh, a region in northern India, during the Pratihar period. Now, that period is named after a dynasty that ruled much of northern India from the mid-8th to the 11th century, and iconographically and stylistically, the sculpture was dated toward the end of that period. The sculpture was loaned to the museum in 1974, and it was gifted 2 years later, in 1976, by Harold and Jane Ullman, a couple from Santa Monica, California, seen here on the slide with Ron Otsika, the museum's curator of Asian art, about 2 years in his tenure in the mid-70s. The sculpture had been purchased by the Ullmans from the Nancy Weiner Gallery, a gallery in New York dealing in antiquities, and more on this gallery later. The Ullmans were typical collectors of the time who traveled throughout southern Asia between the 1960s until the mid-1970s, until Harold's death in 1975. They were captivated with art of the area, and they collected sculpture from India, Nepal, and Indonesia, and built up a significant collection purchased mostly from dealers in Asia, Canada, and the United States. Their collection in this area was guided mostly by a professor from UCLA, a Leroy Davidson, who exhibited part of their collection in several exhibitions in 1968 and 1970 in California. Now, in the mid-1970s, the museum staff became acquainted with the Ullmans through an association with a local professor, Mary Lanius. With Mary Lanius and the museum's curator, Ron Otsika, an exhibition was organized featuring their collection called South Asian Sculpture, the Harold P. and Jane F. Ullman Collection. The exhibition ran from January to February 1975, and it was accompanied by a publication illustrated on the slide here, in which the Uma Maheshvara sculpture was included. The sculpture went back on display later in the museum's Asian permanent collection galleries, and it was installed for another exhibition called Linking Asia, Art, Trade, and Devotion between December 2017 and April 2018, which you can see here in this installation shot right here. And it also appears in the exhibition's accompanying publication. Now, when the museum received correspondence from Indian officials in the summer of 2021, their documentation included a report that had been signed by the superintendent archaeologist from the Archaeological Survey of India's Northern Circle District, illustrated on the slide here. And the report included a theft of this sculpture along with 3 others at the temple complex of Adabadri on the evening of September the 30th, 1967. Along with a copy of the report was an image of the sculpture that had been documented from the Archaeological Survey's records, and you can see it in the image they sent, flanked by other sculptures from the site. Now, scholars and researchers working with the government of India became aware of the location of the sculpture at the Denver Art Museum from an online collection, on the museum's website, where the work had been posted since 2018. Now, the Temple of Adibadri, in which this report recorded this came from, is located in northern India, in the Indian state of Uttarakhand, in the Shamoli Garhwal district, and the name Adibadri is derived from a group of 14 temples thought originally to number 16 that are dedicated to Lord Vishnu and various other deities that were constructed between the 8th and the 12th centuries BC. And there's Adibadri right there on the map. Now, upon receiving information from the Indian government officials, the museum moved forward to recommend deaccession of the work. The acquisitions and deaccessions policy clearly state the museum will not knowingly acquire any work known to have been stolen or illegally imported into the United States, or if any artwork already in the collection is similarly found to be the same. The work was formally removed from the collection by the Board of Trustees at the next board meeting, and it was returned to the Consulate of India in New York that following January. Now, to finish building out this story around this repatriation, it's important that we look at the convention laws and guidelines that were in place during the time when the Ullmans were collecting and when the museum acquired this work, and put that in context to where we are today. The 1970 UNESCO Convention on the illicit import-export of cultural property in November of 1970 was one of the first major international efforts to combat illegal trade in art and antiquities, and it was the first one that had the most effective impact in the United States. The convention urged countries to create a unified framework to address this problem. It stressed the need for countries to put in place preventative measures to support more oversight of cultural property, like putting in more resources for doing inventory and documenting ancient sites and collections, issuing export certifications, and making more of a concerted effort to monitor trade within each country's border. The convention also pressed countries to support more legal pathways in their own laws that would allow a country to recover and return stolen property, so-called repatriation provisions. And lastly, it emphasized the importance of international cooperation and how crucial it was for countries to create ties that would encourage mutual assistance with these efforts. Now, though the U.S. did sign on to that convention in 1970, it did not create legislation for it until 13 years later in 1983, with passage by Congress of the Cultural Property Implementation Act. The act primarily allows the government to enter into 5-year renewable bilateral or multilateral agreements that put import restrictions for certain categories of cultural property. And today there are about 24 bilateral agreements in place. Now, India, like other countries, has always maintained its own internal laws to protect its cultural heritage. After India became a republic in 1950, the principal law that had the most impact in the country has been its Antiquities and Art Treasures Act of 1972. But unfortunately, it has not been very effective in slowing trafficking, especially during decades following the 1970 UNESCO Convention, mostly due to the large scope of cultural heritage in India, the lack of resources in documenting, protecting, and policing borders, and the persistence of looters in the art markets. The 1970 UNESCO Convention had its most visible impact on the U.S. museum world by recommendations that turned the 1970 signing date of the convention into kind of a threshold date, so that only artwork with evidence it was outside a country of origin before 1970 or showing clear evidence it was legally acquired after 1970 should be considered for acquisition. And you start to see the 1970 date enter most U.S. Museum Code of Ethics starting in the early to mid-2000s, when museum professional organizations, most notably the American Association of Art Museum Directors in 2008, posted for its members guidelines on the acquisition of archaeological material and ancient art that emphasized the importance of this date when considering acquisitions. Now, the 1970 threshold date is widely acknowledged as being arbitrary, especially as interpreted in American jurisprudence. And a few key court cases in the 1970s into the 2000s have established precedents even over U.S. law for certain foreign ownership laws for a handful of source countries. Now, there are a number of federal and state law enforcement agencies that have jurisdiction to investigate activity related to illegal import as well as distribution of stolen or looted cultural property. And these include the Department of Justice, its federal attorneys, Department of Homeland Security, as well as various state attorney generals, among others. Federal, district, and state officials of New York are especially notable in their efforts because of the jurisdiction and central role that New York has always played in the art market in the United States. Now, these investigations have resulted in convictions and indictments of individuals connected with trafficking, and there's been repatriations, including works from museums and other collectors that have been linked to evidence uncovered in these investigations. Now, you'll remember I mentioned that the Ullmans purchased the work at some point prior to 1974 from the Doris Wiener Gallery. A prominent art dealer in New York, her daughter Nancy, who took over the business upon her mother's death, was arrested in 2016 by the District Attorney of New York and pled guilty in 2021 for trafficking illicitly acquired works from India, as well as Southeast Asia, and fabricating false provenances for works. Now, the museum never uncovered evidence or received any evidence that the sculpture that was donated by the Ullman sculpture from its connection with the Wiener Gallery, but there have been other artworks connected to the evidence from this gallery that have been repatriated from collections and museums in the United States, including the Denver Art Museum. And you can find information on those repatriations that weren't from India on the museum's website. Now, today, works with ancient or archaeological contexts are one of our focus areas, and we continue to research those collections and their provenance. That includes seeking additional information from experts, scholars, officials from countries of possible origin, and from U.S. officials, as well as posting those works and their provenance histories publicly online. Now, our last case study and story focuses around repatriations connected with the devastating impact of colonial occupation on cultures and cultural heritage. And the example of what happened to Benin culture and what is happening today in restituting artworks from Benin is a case study of success, but also of challenges surrounding the question of who should own or be able to stake a claim on cultural property. In 1955, the museum was excited to acquire for the African collection this bronze plaque belonging to the Benin culture of present-day Nigeria that dated to the 16th and 17th centuries. The plaque is fairly large in size, over 20 inches high and 14 inches wide, and it portrays the figure of a court nobleman or possibly a chief, showing details of his regalia, including his helmet, an elaborate necklace, embroidered skirt, belt, and anklets, and 4 crescent forms in the corner. Now, Benin plaques like this were cast solid metal, and though usually referred to as being bronze, are actually made of brass, another metal alloy, but we still by habit call them Benin bronzes. Now, the Benin plaque was an important work in the museum's collection. It was published in various handbooks beginning in 1964 and reprinted throughout the 1980s. It was on exhibition at various times in the permanent collection galleries, and when the museum debuted its African gallery in the new Hamilton building in 2006, where it remained on display until 2016. Now, plaques like this came from the historical kingdom of Benin, located in West Africa, founded by the Edo people. Their kings were called Obas, who ruled over an area that became a powerful empire by the 15th century. The title and position of Oba still exists today, and the 40th Oba, Uwari II, in fact, was crowned in 2016. Now, the Kingdom of Benin was fueled by trade of the region's resources, as well as involvement in the slave trade, where captives of rival populations were sold into slavery to American and European buyers. Cast plaques like this one are perhaps the best known examples of rich artistic traditions of Benin. Because Benin culture was based on oral tradition, this has made their surviving artwork very important because they represent a visual representation of their history. Now, you can see examples of their artwork in some slides I pulled from a 1994 exhibition that the Denver Art Museum posted called The Treasures from an African Kingdom, Royal Art of Benin from the Pearls Collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Their artwork was created by specialist guilds who worked for the royal court of the Oba and included commemorative heads, animals, and human figures, and royal regalia made of a variety of materials that also included ivory, coral, leather, and wood. The plaques and other artwork served as commissions in ceremonies to honor ancestors, including past Obas and their consorts, and to celebrate the accession of new Obas. Now, during the 1800s, The Kingdom of Benin faced growing interference with their trade networks, especially with the British. And in 1897, in response to an ambush of a party led by British members of the Niger Coast Protectorate, where members were killed, a retaliatory British force, often referred to as the 1897 British Punitive Exhibition of over 1,200 men, captured Benin City and the Oba. Royal and ceremonial buildings, sacred sites, and houses were looted, and many, including the palace, were burned down and destroyed. The Oba at the time was Ovanrumwen Nogbasi, pictured here in the center with his 2 wives, and other members of his family and retinue who had to surrender to the British, and where the Oba later died in exile. Now, a large number of objects, estimated at 2,500 to 4,000, including an estimated 1,000 plaques and sculptures, were confiscated by the British Admiralty. And you can see pictures here on the left and right of British soldiers and the interior of Oba's compound with artworks plundered during the raid. The artworks went to London with the returning British forces, where some were retained by British soldiers, some were auctioned to help defray costs of the expedition, and others were acquired by the British Museum. Fast forward today, and Benin works are in private and museum collections all over the world. Now, the case of the museum's plaque, the Provenance, was not clear when it was acquired. The museum purchased it in 1955 from the Karlbach Gallery, a prominent New York gallery that sold ancient art and modern primitive artists. Later research by the museum staff in the 1960s through the 1980s confirmed that the gallery had probably purchased it a year earlier at auction. Now, when the work was acquired, files document that it had been painted black, and upon cleaning, a white number 60 was revealed in one of the corners, which proved critical in determining its provenance. After the 1897 expedition, we know the plaques and other artworks were sent to London and deposited with the government's Foreign Office. A year later, over 300 of the plaques were sent to the British Museum for display in an exhibition at that time, a document recorded which plaques went on loan by assigning them a Foreign Office number. The number 60 is one of those numbers. Now, after the exhibition, the British Museum requested 203 of the plaques as a gift from the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, but the plaque from the Dams collection was not one of them. The list in the center of the slide shows that number 60 was circled and crossed in red here, indicating that it was either rejected for acquisition or was not available for transfer to the museum. The final disposition of all plaques and where they would go, including number 60, is confirmed on the list, which dates from that time, labeled the fate of the Benin bronzes, the fate of the Benin bronze plaques. And you can see this list on the image to the right. And it shows that plaque number 60 was retained by the Foreign Office as designated by FO. Right there. Now, for some time, we did not know what happened to the plaque after it was kept by the Foreign Office, but further research confirmed that it became the property of a Sir Claude Frederick William Russell. He was a British diplomat who joined the Foreign Office and diplomatic service in 1897, and he served various important posts, including as minister to Ethiopia, Switzerland, and as ambassador to Portugal. Toward the end of his life, Claude Russell later consigned it to a Sotheby's auction in London in December of 1954. And you can see the slide here indicates it was sold as his property as lot number 190 from where it was purchased by the Karlbach Gallery. So we have a complete provenance, which is incredibly satisfying to a provenance researcher, that traces the plaque's complete history all the way back to the 1897 British Punitive Expedition and its origins from Benin City. Now, the momentum to return Benin bronzes has slowly built since the 1960s, when Nigeria gained independence, and is largely based on what is considered the unjust circumstances of the raid, the plunder of the artworks, destruction of Benin culture, and the fact today that nearly all historical Benin art is outside of Nigeria and outside the ability of most Nigerians to access. In 2007, the Benin digital dialogue group was formed from a working group of people from European cultural institutions and Nigerian representatives with the principal focus to advocate bringing works back from Benin City. In 2010, another effort began with the formation by an international team to create a comprehensive digital Benin database of all Benin culture. And it came online in 2022 with over 5,300 objects from 136 institutions from 20 countries, including the Denver Art Museum. Another big influence was the 2018 report that was commissioned by French President Emmanuel Macron called the Savoy Report on the restitution of African cultural heritage. And it was influential because it was the first time a Western country was suggesting national support for restitution efforts, and it really widened the ethics surrounding collections not just from Benin, but from other African countries that may have been acquired unethically from colonial era practices. In 2020, a more popular influence came from a seminal book called The Brutish Museum, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, which was written by Dan Hicks, a professor and curator of archaeology at the Pitts River Museum in Oxford, that drew a spotlight on, in particular, the injustices of the 1897 British expedition. Finally, in October of 2022, the American Association of Art Museum Directors published guidance on art from colonized areas. And I have to give a shout out to a fellow Provenance researcher from MFA Boston, Victoria Reed, who's written and spoken about how to assess collections that may have come from colonized contexts that heavily influenced the guidelines. Now, due to the momentum for restituting Benin bronzes, a number of physical repatriations has been growing. In 2021, repatriations have happened from England and Scotland and France. In 2022, the German government promised to transfer ownership of over 1,100 Benin bronzes from 6 German museums. And also in 2022, the Smithsonian Museum of African Art and the National Gallery of Art transferred ownership of some of their bronzes as well. Now, when the Native Arts Department at the Denver Art Museum completed its research on the museum's Benin plaque, the plaque was presented for deaccession on ethical grounds due to proof that it had been forcibly taken as part of the 1897 expedition, and the board approved deaccession of it in May of 2022. Now, the museum wrote a letter to discuss its transfer to Nigeria and potentially considering keeping the work on loan to the National Commission for Museums and Monuments in Nigeria, and that's the agency responsible for negotiating and administering care for most of the Benin bronzes up to date, and we received a positive acknowledgement. But a week later, a presidential declaration was made by the outgoing Nigerian president, officially recognizing the current Oba of Benin, Oba Aware II, as the owner and custodian of all Benin bronzes that were looted and currently in care of the government and soon to be returned. Now, since his ascension to the throne, the current Oba Aware II has called for a return of the Benin bronzes, but has also expressed his desire to see the bronzes displayed not just in museums in Nigeria, including one that he hopes will be constructed in Benin City near his palace, but also around the world. The complexity of who owns cultural patrimony is really laid bare with the example of the Benin bronzes. At various times, the national government has negotiated repatriations on behalf of the nation, but also the Oba of Benin, who's a direct descendant of the interests of the Benin people. Another group that's factored into claiming the bronzes is a group called the Restitution Study Group. They represent descendants of enslaved peoples living in the United States, Caribbean, and Britain, and they strongly oppose their transfer to Nigeria. Their position is that Benin bronzes should be the wealth and legacy of slave descendants, not slave traders, who they label the Oba's predecessors as being. Now, the basis of their claim rests on the fact that many of the Benin bronzes were made from metal manillas, which were the principal form of currency preferred by the Kingdom of Benin from Europeans who purchased slaves. And these were melted down by artist guilds to create many of the bronze works, including plaques, which has been borne out by a few studies that show similar metal compositions of the plaques sampled from the 16th to 18th century that's similar to documented manillas that were found in shipwrecks and land sites involved in the transatlantic trade. This group actually sued to stop return to the National Gallery of Art Benin bronzes in 2022, but a court considering the request denied it due to lack of standing. And at the moment, the legal support seems to rest primarily with the Oba in Nigeria. So we've just journeyed with 4 artworks that were repatriated or restituted, 4 different cultures, 4 sets of histories, time periods, and context. The legal and ethical principles in these 4 areas and reflected by these 4 case studies are driven by standards that have evolved over time, which I think the quote by Maya Angelou here sums up well. So what are the major forces in play represented by these 4 returns, and how do we inform our current process for considering future and potential repatriations? The big idea behind the Zuni war god repatriation is that even though it predated NAGPRA by 10 years, the principles surrounding its return were very much centered on the same ones that NAGPRA adopted and enforced and that have been re-emphasized by revised guidelines just this past January. The importance of communication, consultation, cultural affiliation, and object's purpose, and how it left its local context are all circumstances of its history that helps tribal groups and museums, including the Denver Art Museum, along the process to identify works subject to repatriation. The restitution of the painting The Letter by the museum to heirs of Paul Hartog illustrates the tragedies of World War II and Nazi-era looting. There are so many more resources available today and more coming online. Lost art databases, documentation, and archives from even before and during and after the war and elsewhere are continuing to be digitized and be made more publicly accessible. Successful claims still have a high bar, and those based on economic duress principle, like the painting that was restituted from Dam's collection, is still not as common or successful as restitutions of works that were stolen or outright seized. And even with the 25th anniversary of the Washington Principles just last month, it's recognized that more efforts are needed by parties, governments, legal systems, museums, and claimants to continue to work through the challenges. The repatriation of the Uma Maheshvara and the context of repatriations of ancient art and antiquities is very much centered on concerns that were recognized and outlined in the 1970 UNESCO Convention. A large number of countries, up to 143 today, have signed on and have incorporated some aspects into their own laws. The museum world has done the same with respect to guidelines that influence the acquisition of works from antiquity. But the success of repatriations is largely driven by legal circumstances which depend on the degree of documented evidence of theft or a strong case for circumstantial evidence that tie works to specific sites and known and documented trafficking networks and specific dealers. And finally, the momentum surrounding the repatriation of Benin bronzes is widely accepted based on the injustices and the destruction of Benin culture and the need to reunite works with peoples where they originated. Guidelines for how museums approach provenance research and collections that may have been acquired unethically, especially from cultures impacted during the colonial era, are recognizing that the approach guiding NAGPRA with consultation with living communities can be helpful. The Denver Art Museum today navigates decisions on repatriations in the same way it has in the past, guided by law, professional and ethical guidelines, and operating under institutional policies and practices as we continue our commitment to this important work. Each object that might be subject to potential repatriation or restitution undergoes due diligence, review, and research into its context, its history, who made it, what its function or purpose was, how it transferred from its local context, and what the laws in the country of origin and the U.S. were at the time of collection or acquisition. Part of that review includes consultation and collaboration with scholars, experts, individuals, communities, and countries of origin, as well as U.S. and foreign officials. And we also continue to post collections and provenance histories online for works that fall under our focus areas of research that are represented by these 4 case studies in an effort to make these collections publicly available as we continue our work. Now, the Dam's not alone among U.S. museums in having a history of repatriations, in our case, spanning over half a century. You can find a majority of Dam's repatriations over the years posted from original press releases or blogs on the museum's website. Press releases were never released for most of the works repatriated under NAGPRA, but those are posted in the Federal Register on the National Park Service NAGPRA website. Although one of the outcomes of provenance research may be a repatriation or a restitution, the purpose of provenance research is to fill in an object story that includes the artist or people who made them and the context of its journey to the museum, all of which is part of the important storytelling of an artwork. These 4 objects that I've shared tonight have important stories to tell, and telling these stories ultimately is our goal as we undertake this important work. Feel free to check out the museum's Provenance research page and our online collection, and contact us if you have any information to offer us about our collection or any questions. Thank you. So we have a little bit of time to honor everyone's probably future plans this evening. So we're going to do a Q&A, starting first here in the room. And I don't know if you want to discuss the logistics, Christy?
Yeah, so we have about 10 minutes for questions. So raise your hand, and then one of us, Andy over there, Renee over there, and I over here will bring the microphone to you, and you can ask your question.
So I've been fascinated with this topic ever since I watched Monuments Men, maybe before. And the one thing that I wonder about is obviously the growing prevalence of the internet and stuff. Some people might say, well, that makes it easy. I'm going, I bet it doesn't. Could you address some of the ways in which the growing online stuff has been very helpful, and some ways in which people might think it would be helpful that it hasn't turned out to be as good as you hoped, or it hasn't yet?
You know, digitizing archives and resources like that take resources. It takes money and staff. And although there are a lot of institutions in the United States and Europe that have spent funds to do so, there's still so much that's not available. And a lot of our budget is spent on travel to go to archives that are not digitized. And although we can be happy that we can get scanned documentation, and sometimes we can get information scanned, through other sources, it is still really an issue for us. Another kind of concern that's been mentioned by AAMD has been the fact that even though investigations by legal authorities are potentially over, a lot of the archives that they have from seized dealers and others that have been indicted or convicted are still not available to the public, and probably aren't because of issues with confidentiality. And so it would be great if museums could have access to this information to assist us with our research. And that's one of the frustrating things that AAMD has mentioned. All we know is that as time goes on, more and more resources are becoming available. Renee Stokesbury, our associate provenance researcher here, researched a lot of works in our collection 3 years ago. And then even looking at some of them today, it's just amazing how much more information is out there. So provenance research is never done. And, we always say provenance research completed to date. And we know that for some important works or works where questions arise, it's worth our while, it's worth our time, it's worth our due diligence to keep searching for sources. And of course, we have contacts with our provenance research fellows and other colleagues who know what we're looking for, and we all keep each other informed about what's coming online.
Got that one?
What's your prediction about the Elgin marbles? And what happens?
Not going there.
Okay. And what does a country like France think about what's in the Louvre, where there's Napoleon stole thousands of items from other European countries?
That's something that's happening more and more. And I don't know, Renee, if you want to add some things there, but it seems like there's more purchase for returning works that have legal concepts that date 100 years ago. But when you get back to the Napoleonic era, when this inflection point of when we should consider legal concepts and also ethical guidelines in place is just really wavy. It's just hard to say. But I think as time goes on, we're gonna go back in time, especially as more resources are available. Renee, do you have something to say about that, about Napoleonic era, or how things are moving slowly backwards in time?
Sure. So, of course, Nazi era sort of has leaned into going further, even further beyond into Napoleonic era. And as Lori mentioned, the resources being digitized are more and more, and so we are able to go back even further in time than we were even 5 years ago. So I think you may potentially start seeing more Napoleonic era subject matter come up in the narrative in the field. I know that we are talking internally about some things that we've been able to go back that far. So it's still fairly new, I think, in our field of study because there's just not a lot of rich information out there, but more and more is coming, and that is allowing us to go even further back. I can't speak to the Louvre, but nor will I. I think that we've got a lot more work to do to go that far back. But I think as far as claims coming out, there's really no case history and there's really no real clear guidelines going back that far. So we just stick with what we know and what we have available.
Okay. Final question? Oh, right here.
Could you review again the date of November 1970 and what significance that has in evaluating acquisitions?
Sure. 1970 is based on an international convention, the UNESCO convention, and to date, as I mentioned, 143 countries have signed on to it, and its principles encourage countries to use their own legal systems to support the understanding that there were source countries with rich traditions of cultural patrimony that were taken advantage of with the art market and have filtered through the international art market. And so the 1970 date, which started to be talked about as when that convention happened, there were a few very collection-rich museums, like the University of Pennsylvania, for example, and I think Harvard actually incorporated immediately 1970 as a date to consider for acquisitions at that time. But most museums move with their peers, and it took a lot of other guidelines and a lot of other pressure for conservative institutions like AAM and AAMD to recognize 1970 as an important date. And museums usually put this in their collection management policies, and they've followed it pretty stringently. AAMD actually, as part of their guidelines, requested that museums post collections that they acquired after 2008, that's when their guidelines came out, that may potentially have been acquired after 1970, but had good circumstantial evidence that probably it was out of the country before 1970. So it's an arbitrary date, but it's a standard that museums have followed for 40 years right now, and we work hard to see not just the 1970 date, but we're also now looking at country of origins, cultural patrimony laws, looking at U.S. law, looking and seeing what court cases have come up that recognize source country laws, and we're really trying to be as thorough as we can, along with all this other information that we pull together in researching the context of works in our provenance history research.
We can take one last question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for an excellent talk. I really appreciated this. I'm curious to know, at what point are individual collectors held accountable for purchasing artworks that might not be the most clean when it comes to provenance, especially with current auction house discourse that's happening? I can't imagine purchasing in good faith very much right now, so yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of collectors are moving toward being more ethical in their collecting. Certainly auction houses and dealers are following good provenance research principles and making sure that they have a good clean provenance that goes back fairly far. The kind of stories that you hear about collectors who have their artwork seized or forfeited are usually those that could have been associated with improper import into the United States through the customs organizations and dealers as well. That's a common way that works are seized or forfeited is at the border. And then it takes really a lot of investigative work, like some of the investigations of the District Attorney of New York with indicted or convicted dealers like Nancy Weiner, Subhash Kapoor, Douglas Latchford, for example. the information that they get from subpoenas and other closed confidential sources of documentation allows them to engage in investigations that identify for them from the archives where some of these collections live, and they're able, to put some collectors on notice. And so you see that there are collectors that also are being having their work seized and forfeited.
And I think that wraps up questions. If you have a question and you didn't have an opportunity to ask it, you can send it anytime to Provenance at denverartmuseum.org. We also recommend, if you want to go onto our website, denverartmuseum.org/provenance, you can see a lot of the resources that Lori mentioned in her talk today.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.